Buonasera a tutti e benvenuti a questo penultimo intervento del nostro percorso nel nostro seminario di aggiornamento. Fino a questo punto abbiamo ascoltato varie discussioni della ricerca attuale in cui spesso l'opera lucana viene messa in rapporto con altri testi, ma testi piuttosto biblici, testi dell'Antico Testamento, no? Del Pentateuco, e anche specialmente la letteratura profetica, ma anche la letteratura sapienziale, tutto il patrimonio dell'Antico Testamento. Ma anche Luca-Atti, l'opera lucana, in rapporto con testi cristiani, con gli altri vangeli sinottici, con la tradizione evangelica in cui viene conservata la storia di Gesù, ma anche in rapporto con le letteratura paolina, come abbiamo ascoltato questa mattina. Per questo intervento, relazioni invece, pensavamo di offrire un'altra prospettiva, un altro punto di vista, per mettere l'opera lucana in rapporto con testi non biblici, sempre per collocare gli scritti di Luca nel suo contesto letterario e anche storico. E per questo argomento abbiamo invitato un esperto su questo, il professore Steve Mason. È il mio piacere e onore di presentarlo a voi. Professor Stephen Mason attualmente è un professore in cattedrato, si dice? Ha una cattedra. A Distinguished Professor of Ancient Mediterranean Religions and Cultures presso la Facoltà di Teologia e Scienze Religiose dell'Università di Groningen in Olanda. Professor Mason è ben conosciuto nel campo della storia dell'antichità e specialmente sugli scritti, l'opera di Giuseppe Flavio. Ha pubblicato già molti articoli, anche libri su Giuseppe Flavio, anche è il editore di un grande opera, Magnum Operum, in quanti volumi previsto? 16? 16 volumi, il testo è anche un commentario su tutti gli scritti di Giuseppe Flavio in 16 volumi. Il professor Mason è l'editore generale per questa grande opera. È già pubblicati, quanti? How many volumes already? 9?
9 volumes.
Sì, già pubblicati 9 volumi. Allora, un grande piacere per noi ascoltare il suo intervento su il rapporto fra Luca-Atti e la letteratura storiografica dell'epoca. Allora, benvenuti a te.
Well, thank you very much. I can't tell you, first of all, are my microphones on? Are they?
Okay. Prova.
Is that better now? Yeah, okay. I can't tell you what a privilege and honor it is for me to be here in the great city of Rome, to be your guest. Thank you very much for this invitation. I'd like to thank especially Dean Béchard and Carlo Valentino for their assiduous efforts to make me feel like a VIP, as we say in English. I feel like a very important person this week. I don't feel like that at home, but I do feel like that here. It's been wonderful. You've treated me extraordinarily well. So thank you also to the staff at the Biblicum, and thank you to you for coming out on Friday afternoon at the very end of what I know has been a long and demanding week, and especially for a talk in Inglese. I'm sorry that I can't speak to you in Italian, but thank you very much for your patience and willingness to try with me. I'll try to make it as painless as possible with a visual presentation, which I hope I shall keep up with the slides as I'm reading. I think you also have an Italian translation, and thanks again to the Biblicum for making that available to you. I should tell you that I have changed a little bit from that, so basically it's there, what I'm trying to say in your text, but in the interest of time and clarity, I have edited it a little bit, so I hope you can still follow along, especially with the aid of the pictures behind me and the screens. Our theme is Luke, Acts, and historiography. This is a rich subject, and I feel rather like a juggler trying to keep several balls in the air at once. The context of ancient history writing, the changing directions of research on this question in the last century, the relevance of Flavius Josephus's work to Luke Acts, and then, of course, the payoff, if there is one in all of this, for understanding Luke Acts. I'm keenly aware that there are several Luke Acts specialists in the room, and you must know immediately from the introduction already that I am not one of those. I am coming at this from the direction of historiography generally. So I must ask already in advance the indulgence and perhaps absolution of my colleagues in Luke Acts studies for any howlers that I commit with respect to the scholarship. My talk has three parts. In the first, I will propose that calling Luke Acts historiography and calling it history are two very different things. And this difference matches a fissure in scholarship. In the second part, I ask why we need to assign a genre to Luke Acts at all, or whether we do. And this second part has the main content, as you can see in subcategories there, of the paper, the presentation. In the third section, I want to use Josephus's contemporary histories, if possible, to throw a little bit of light on this question of what do we mean by Luke Acts and historiography. A watershed study establishing the link between Josephus and Luke Acts, between historiography and Luke Acts. Josephus is so much near the surface of my brain that I occasionally just say the word at random when it doesn't fit. So the watershed work on Luke Acts and ancient historiography was the second volume of the 5-volume work, The Beginnings of Christianity, Part 1, edited by F.J. Folks-Jackson and Cursip Lake in 1922. Both editors were British, classically trained in public schools in Oxbridge, who finished their careers in the U.S. In Lake's case, because his disenchantment with theologically driven New Testament research was excluding him from higher academic positions in England. While Lake was professor in Leiden for 10 years, before 1914, and before either one went to the U.S., he and Folks-Jackson discovered each other and conceived of a project that would explain Christian origins as a whole from a purely historical perspective, they said. Having fully absorbed historical Jesus research of the preceding century, they saw Christianity as a movement not anticipated by Jesus, which, quote, achieved a synthesis between Greco-Oriental, and the Jewish religions in the Roman Empire. That is, the preaching begun by Jesus passed into the sacramental cult of the Lord Jesus Christ, unquote. Since the book of Acts is the only surviving account of this crucial transitional period between Jesus and Christian proclamation, they thought it necessary to devote phase one of their project to a critical study of Acts. They never got beyond that phase, published in the 1920s and early 30s, and their part one remains as a monument to human ambition failed and foiled. To write the important second volume in this series, they enlisted the controversial Quaker, classicist, pacifist, and agnostic Henry Joel Cadbury, later of Harvard, but then of Andover. Cadbury agreed with them about the need to understand Acts in light of ancient historiography and letting the theological chips fall where they may. Now, what did this mean? At the outset, the three of them agreed that Acts, as they say in the introduction, was, quote, a great history, in principle worthy of comparison with Herodotus, Thucydides, or Josephus. But there was an important irony in their use of terms. To understand it, we need to recall that Christian tradition had, of course, always treated Acts as history in the simple sense of a factual record of what happened. But as modern biblical criticism gathered steam in the 18th and 19th centuries, scholars became more aware of Acts' literary tendentiousness and, they said, errors, the Tübingen school holding that it represented a second century theological compromise, Bruno Bauer, Ernest Renan saying it was a legend. So many critics had simply dropped the label history from Acts. They weren't willing to call it history anymore. They preferred to characterize it as theology, dogma, edification, or apology. With that same understanding of what history should mean, but unable to accept the dismissal of Acts historicity, more conservative scholars tried to salvage the book's reputation by showing its factuality, while denying that its literary purposes interfered with these. This approach is still alive and well today, I think, after being advanced by scholars such as Martin Hengel, F.F. Bruce, and Colin Heemer. They argue for the historical character of Acts by insisting on its reliability, basically, more or less. They think it possible to test that accuracy with geographical place names, ancient sailing conditions referred to in Acts, the mechanics of provincial administration under Rome, and so on. If Acts gets these matters correct, as it generally does, they conclude the writer is a very careful historian. The 5-volume Eerdmans project from the 1990s, the Book of Acts in its first century setting, might sound like just an update of Folkes-Jackson and Lake in the 1920s, but actually it is very different in tone and focus. The new series focuses on external connections with archaeology, literature in Palestine, the diaspora, the Greco-Roman world, rather than dwelling on the problems connected with ancient historiography. Over against this whole tradition, then, of history equals accuracy, Cadbury argued in Volume 2 of the Folkes-Jackson Lake series that it was indeed fine to call Acts a great history, but only if one took account of what history writing meant in antiquity, which did not involve much concern for accuracy. He was ahead of his time in calling for scholars to pay much more attention to the nature of ancient historiography and how history was written. In order to responsibly understand this crucial account of Christian origins, he was saying, one needed to understand how people generally wrote about the past 2,000 years ago. Understanding Acts this way was not merely different from proving its historicity, it required a different mindset because it directed scholars' attention to the how of what was being said rather than the underlying facts. As Cadbury develops his picture of ancient history writing, we quickly see how different it was from the effort to prove Acts' historicity. First, he said, ancient historians had a wide range of reasons for writing, but abstract concern for truth was not among them. They often wrote for fellow statesmen in great moral earnest to illustrate the best and worst responses to political situations. More generally, they wrote for moral instruction, diversion, and even entertainment. It followed from these purposes that they tended to care much more about the form of their work than about verifying its content. And the criteria for what counted as good form were taken from rhetorical principles, the very values that ancient education, paideia, inculcated everywhere. These included plausible sequential order, structural balance and symmetry, variation and diversion, never bore your audiences, and completely contrary to our sensibilities, the reworking of sources to integrate them into one's own neat literary creation. Speeches, in particular, were opportunities to pierce the narrative of events and not bore your reader by putting on a showcase of the historian's rhetorical ability. He was free to craft orations for his characters, the main criterion for their suitability being what he thought fitting for each person to say in this context, not what they actually said, which probably couldn't be discovered. Indeed, if an author found speeches already in his source material, he was under obligation to change them in his own work, not to take them over and repeat them as part of his literary craft. So if everyone understood history this way in antiquity, there's no problem at all in calling Acts a great history, but it doesn't imply its factuality, quite the opposite. Now, this didn't mean for Cadbury and Company that ancient historians were free to just make stuff up wholesale. On the contrary, they thought that ancient historians wrote because they were sure that they knew things about the past that were important to say. And they undertook a kind of research to find additional material. But whatever their material, their emphasis was on getting it across effectively, much more than showing precisely what had happened and documenting it. Having laid out this rather bracing summary by 1920 standards, Cadbury began comparing the Lucan double work with other creations of ancient historiography, and he found Luke Acts, to which he compared also Josephus, to be in general agreement with contemporary historiographical practice. So, I said that he was far ahead of his time, and I say that because in the field of classics, although a few scholars were thinking about the artistic qualities of, all ancient classical texts, it would take still another half century before this idea percolated through to classics generally. In 1926, the philosopher-historian R.G. Collingwood told his Oxford undergraduates, quote, "The average professional historian is far less critical in his attitude to Herodotus than the average professional theologian is in his attitude to Mark," unquote. So we should not imagine that biblical studies merely eventually caught up with classics. No, not at all. Critical study of the Old and New Testaments, in fact, largely paved the way for the critical discipline of history in the modern universities, and indeed had an effect on classics. It was not until the late 70s through 90s that authors such as Livy, Polybius, Diodorus, and Pausanias were subjected to searching study as authors rather than mined for their data. This post-hippie period corresponded roughly to that in which redaction and composition critical studies flourished in biblical studies. So, Cadbury, Folkes Jackson, and Lake were not simply asking that New Testament scholars do what classicists all knew how to do. They were making the still contentious and quite sophisticated point for their time that Luke Acts needs to be understood, first of all, as historiographical literature. Now, the working out of these values has been a gradual and contested process in both classics and biblical studies. In classics, it's only been with the work of Anthony Woodman, Peter Wiseman, Christopher Pelling, Chris Kraus, John Marincola, and so on, quite recent studies, that we've come to focus on these aspects, and not without considerable controversy. One consequence of historiography's new prominence in classics has been the increasingly frosty relationship between history and historiography in classics. Elvis Presley used to sing, "We can't go on together with suspicious minds." And scholars of these two disciplines began to suspect the other more and more. The historians saying the historiographers were not interested in what happened anymore. And the historiographers saying, you people can't just take what you want from these texts without understanding how these texts were constructed and what their themes and rhetorical devices are. The divorce between history and historiography may not have been necessary if we'd all accepted the suggestions in such a book as Luke Pitcher's 2010 study, Writing Ancient History. He simply balances the two and says, yes, it's important to know what happened, but we can only do that if we first understand the nature of our sources. I'm going to skip a couple of paragraphs if you're following along. Historians can live free of resentment, it seems to me, about the limitations of our sources if we simply realize that we have no God-given right to know what happened at any time in the human past. If we are nosy enough to want to know that, that is our problem. And it is up to us and no one else to figure it out as well as we can. There is no point blaming our sources for their faults. We should be grateful that any ancient accounts have survived at all, rather than blaming them for their defects. If we want to know about the past, it's our business to figure it out. Now, section 2, then, was historiography really a thing in the ancient world? What about this genre issue? Well, Cadbury Lake and Folks Jackson made a huge advance in tying Luke Acts to ancient historiography, no question about it. But almost a century later, we're still trying to figure out what that means exactly. Was historiography itself something fixed and stable, or was it, as in, I don't know if you've seen children's cartoons where the child thinks there's a stable property there and rests something on it, turns out to be a bear or an elephant that gets up and moves. Is it something actually shifting and shape-shifting that we can't really connect to? In other words, was there a genre of history writing, actually? And if so, what made it a genre? Well, a common sense approach says that authors must choose a genre and play by its rules if they're going to write anything at all. We need to know what the writer intends and what rules they're playing by. Obviously, if they are writing tragedy or comedy, if they intend humor or sarcasm, we need to know what the intention is. But the genres we know about most clearly in antiquity, tragedy and comedy on the stage, had rules because they were performance genres and they had to be judged by those rules. Was there any reason for history writing to have any such clear generic guidelines, and did it? Well, on the one hand, no one can miss the many clear statements in Hellenistic and Roman authors that history was a distinctive activity, usually for members of the cultural elite. Herodotus was called the father of history, after all, because he was understood to have initiated a new kind of literary pursuit, not merely retelling tales, but rather undertaking a new investigation, historiae, into specific events to find out what happened. His pioneering effort faced wide criticism for its gullibility, otherworldly distractions, and lack of patriotism. Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War displaced Herodotus as the kind of gold standard, an ultimate exemplar, even though he avoided the word historia. But he laid down a high standard for everyone to follow. Later on, it was agreed by ancient writers, all the way to antiquity, that Thucydides had set the gold standard of historical excellence, and we see this all the way through late antiquity, people still referring back to Thucydides. But there's no point trying to imitate him. The best you could do to pay homage to him was to try to redo what Thucydides had achieved in your own way and not make yourself look silly by actually parroting him in some way, as Lucian criticized many people for doing. By the time that Polybius wrote his 40-volume account of Rome's rise in the mid-2nd century, he could assume the audience's conviction that Historia was a pursuit for men of affairs looking for examples and lessons of political morality. And this view of history helps to explain its characteristic features. First, it was usually written by prominent public figures. They alone could claim deep knowledge of political and military affairs. As it happens, many were written by men on the margins, such as Thucydides, Xenophon, and Josephus. Perhaps their marginal status, their exile or similar, allowed them to see things that others could not see so clearly. Second, the formal features of history writing, especially the prologue, highlighting the author's unique basis for knowledge and insight, arose from his need to assert his moral authority. Very important that the author identify himself and say where his authority comes from. Here's my life, here's what I've done, here's what I've experienced. Third, therefore, history was not a profession. Here's a transposed paragraph if you're following along. It was later in the text I brought it forward. History was not a profession. This is well known, you all know it very well, but it's worth emphasizing for our question of genre. We call Tacitus a historian, but in his dialogue on oratory, just like his friend Pliny the Younger's letters, we can see that histories were being recited alongside tragedy and poetry by the very same group of elite male writers. Again, we call Strabo the geographer, but that's only because his geography happened to have survived. He also wrote a history, which he seemed to think was more important, and the geography was a complement to that. The rhetorical handbooks all say that the reason you learn rhetoric is so that you can write in any mode and format you please. You learn the same principles for writing across all of these types of literature. Being men of status, historians expected a hearing for whatever they wrote, whatever they preferred to write, grammar books or philosophical treatises. They were not professional historians. They just asserted their standing in society by writing this way and presenting their work. Fourth, this literary flexibility helps us to understand the extremely diverse contents of ancient histories. When they did decide to write history, such men were well positioned to experiment with its contents and with its forms. A basic requirement of rhetoric was variation, but the kind, number, and size of digressions, the ways in which they varied their text, was up to each individual writer. The father of history, Herodotus, had included huge stretches of mythology, ethnography, and human geography in his history. Thucydides didn't. He followed up with imposing speeches and political analysis. Polybius, who had little time for either speeches or the drama, included just lots of political discussion. So it was up to the author. Now, it's true that a few ancient writers mention what they call history's laws, which certainly could give the impression that history was a thing. History writing was a fixed genre. If it had laws, it must, we might think, be some kind of a genre, right? Lucian remarks, for example, that Thucydides made it a law, that the historian must put aside personal inclinations and just tell the truth, irrespective of whom he offended. Polybius begs his readers' pardon for departing from proper historical narrative when he indulges in rhetoric. Sorry, I have to catch up my slides here with what I was saying to you. Oh, okay. That'll do. Well, we'll just leave it there for the moment. I'll catch up with the slides in a second. So different writers included whatever they wanted in these laws of history, however. So we hear about these laws of history, but what do they mean? Polybius saying, well, I'm going to put aside the laws of history while I use rhetoric for a moment to criticize the people who caused the fall of Corinth. Cicero refers to a law, or laws of history, that one must always tell the truth and not have either favor or malice toward anybody. Nevertheless, he asks his respected historian friend Lucas, who knows how to write soaring prose, to please disregard the laws of history when he recounts his own consulship. Can you just kind of nudge the laws of history aside while you talk about me? Josephus, too, refers to the laws of history. In the prologue of his Judean War, he ostentatiously says, I must lay aside the laws of history in order to heap blame on the people who caused the fall of Jerusalem. And when he comes to the passage later on in Book 5 of the war, that's what he will do again. He will say, you have to pardon me for leaving the laws of history aside while I criticize the rebels who led to Jerusalem's destruction. The remarkable thing about these laws of history, therefore, is they are mainly mentioned when people want to violate them. They are not something that actually turn up in any concrete form where we can see what the laws of history writing were. It's more that when people want to indulge in rhetoric, and they do so quite unashamedly and quite openly and ostentatiously, they say, well, here I'm going to violate the laws of history. So what is this about? Well, it seems to me a clear proof that history had no generic constraints. They were simply doing what they wanted to do, and they were using this idea of the laws of history as a proof of their sincerity and their power. Yes, it's forcing me, my subject is forcing me to even lay aside the laws of history. Please forgive me. Of course, they didn't feel they needed forgiveness. They were quite deliberately violating these. So the clearest proof that history had no generic constraints is simply the variety of subjects that it dealt with. Excuse me 1 second, I'm trying to catch up with my slides. I don't know what happened here. Yeah, the laws of history and so on. But the clearest proof that there were no laws of history is simply the great diversity in historical output. We have histories of a single volume, 144 volumes. We have histories that deal with a single event, a war. We have histories of all time, universal histories of scores of volumes. We have history that is highly rhetorical. We have history that abjures rhetoric. So where are the generic guidelines? I think there were none. That's what I'm suggesting to you. It seems then that history, though broadly inspired by the project of Herodotus and Thucydides as something to do, something for elite men to do, was not actually a genre. That is, in any sense of having prescribed rules. It was a pursuit. Now, one of the most important questions that raises is the relationship between history and biography, especially if we're looking at Luke Acts. A famous remark by Plutarch in his Life of Alexander, where he says, quote, "It must be borne in mind that my design is not to write histories, but biographies," unquote, has led many readers to conclude that ancient history and biography were two different things, right? Quite distinct from each other. It's highly doubtful, however, that that's what he meant, because he goes on to say that the difference between biography and history is really one of zoom. It's really one of focus. Writing biography liberates him from all the detail he would have had to include with his history. But they're not different, because many other times in his writings, Plutarch says, I'm writing history, and I'm using historical sources, and I'm contributing to history in doing that. Indeed, a number of writers we call historians, from Polybius and Sallust to Josephus and Tacitus, wrote both larger histories and biographies, and they didn't seem to distinguish between the two. And this is quite interesting for Luke Acts, obviously, right? You have a biography and you have a larger history. Indeed, the blurring of any distinction between history and biography was compounded by the Roman tendency to write history as biography, as serial biography. Since rhetoric focused on character and evaluating human lives, and history was a branch of rhetoric, it was natural to write even large histories in terms of individual biographies rather than according to periods. So Suetonius's lives, which together constitute a kind of history of the Julio-Claudian period and beyond, are not very different in this respect from Tacitus' histories, which include all this detailed biographical information on Tiberius and later emperors. Christina Kraus says, therefore, that it is a great mistake to separate too rigorously history from biography. They are not, in their character, fundamentally different. So, tying all this together, it seems to me best to understand Greco-Roman historiography not as a defined genre comparable to tragedy or comedy with rules, but as a project inspired by Xenophon, Thucydides, Herodotus, Xenophon, and Polybius, and that sort of thing. People trying to do what they did, but with a completely open field for their own creativity. So Luke Acts looks like historiography, as indeed Cadbury showed, in several obvious ways. First of all, it ticks a few boxes, right? Nobody doubts that. First, although it is only a sentence long, the prologue that occupies Luke 1:1-4 includes the essential elements of longer historical proems. Sitting apart from the wonder narrative that begins at 1:5, which adopts a very different language, the prologue addresses the reader directly via a patron who fulfills exactly the same role as Josephus' patron and is addressed with the same term, kratiste, in far fewer words than Josephus, however. The Christian author manages to rubbish other attempts to write up this past. He says, many polloi have taken it upon themselves to do this, to structure a narrative, but since I have followed everything precisely, I can hardly refrain from telling you the asphalia, a reliable picture of what really happened. So this language of akribos, asphalia, this is characteristic historiographical language. These are buzzwords in historiography. Second, this author's unique fusion of a biography with a history among the early Christian writers is just in keeping with what everybody was doing. Third, other historiographical seeming elements in Luke Acts include the constant changes of scene, the author's interest in correct geographical information, fascinating, adventurous digressions by sea, shipwrecks, and so on, just like we find in other authors. And he dismisses his enemies. He also has a whole bunch of speeches, 21 at least I count in Acts. So it looks kind of like historiography. We shouldn't fault Lake and Cadbury and Folkes-Jackson for making that connection. Nevertheless, by the 1980s, some scholars were saying, wait just a minute. Yes, it kind of looks like historiography at an obvious level, but there are some major differences. And the two strongest challenges that I'm familiar with, at least, and specialists here I'm sure will know others, came from Loveday Alexander and Richard Purvo. Alexander, noting significant mismatches of tone and content between Luke and the general run of elite historiographical literature, explored instead the formal functional parallels with what she calls scientific literature in the ancient world. By that, she means fachprosa. That is, not really scientific literature in the sense we mean, but literature written for an in-group who know the subject already, the subject material. And she said it's written at a lower level than the elite historiography, and it is more like for an in-house group. So it's not really historiography. A more or less opposite suggestion came from Richard Purvo's 1987 study, Profit with Delight. Purvo began from two premises. On the one hand, a degree of historical carelessness in acts, he thought, which rendered ridiculous any claim to serious history. On the other hand, the predominance in the story of exciting adventures. He found the closest parallels to these in historical novels, such as Joseph and Asenath, and in the apocryphal Acts of the Apostles, which he dubbed all novels. These are much more historical novels than actual historiography. Now, many reviewers have responded to Alexander and Purvo over the years, but from the perspective I'm developing here, I want to say that both, it seems to me, make important points about the shortfall between Luke Acts and historiography, but their solutions to find another genre to put it in seem to me equally problematic because of the general difficulty of finding genres in the ancient world. Historiography, after all, could accommodate a great deal of exciting adventures. Even the austere Polybius recognized the need for much entertainment or terpsis, delight, in history writing. And we've seen that factual accuracy was never an overriding concern. The real problem, however, is that any other genre, for example, the ancient novel, is as difficult to define as history or historiography. So I think there's little point in trying to find another genre for Luke Acts. In my view, there remain, and these authors touched on this, three significant problems with calling Luke Acts historiography. First of all, and quite importantly, it's anonymous. Now, we've seen that the whole driving engine of Greco-Roman historiography was to assert the author's moral character and experience and command of the information. But this author doesn't even say who he was, or possibly who she was, but probably who he was. It's just an anonymous text. Now, you might say, well, Josephus writes a couple of anonymous texts. That is, he doesn't declare his own name in his later writings. But that's because he is quite magnificently introduced himself in his earlier writings, and he has an audience who knows who he is. Could be in Luke Acts, doesn't need it, but still it's not historiography in that same sense if you are not asserting. That's the whole point of historiography, to assert your moral control over the material. Second, the effect of the missing author identification is greatly compounded by the complete absence of any historia language. And it's not only historia from Herodotus that is missing, but even Thucydides' Sungrapho language, which he prefers, that's also missing. So the author is not making any clear attempt to identify with historiography. Third, in place of the normal kind of historical analysis about political affairs, polis realities, interpolis relations, and so on, justice and power as in Thucydides. In place of all that, the author introduces his subject as the deeds that have been fulfilled among us, and the observation and reception of this truth by those who were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, unquote. But historians were not supposed to be anybody's servants. This is antithetical to the idea of historia as inquiry, as open investigation by strenuous effort. No, it's rather the reception of truth. In Luke Acts, the main story clearly comes from revelation. The work's many episodes of heavenly and angelic visitation, beginning with the birth narrative but running entirely through the text, undercut any notion of a historian's practice or historian's authority. There is simply no trace of such things in this anonymous text. That the most important truth comes via revelation is reinforced at critical junctures, from the infancy narrative through the resurrection and ascension, and in the progressive revelations of the book of Acts. We should not, I think, become so fixated then on the parallels with Greco-Roman historiography that we miss the main point of the text. Now, how can we reconcile all of this? The historiographical features that are there with the absence of the more obvious and prominent kinds of historiographical undertakings. Well, and here I come to the third and final part. It's briefer than the previous one, you'll be pleased to know. And this is where I'd like to bring Josephus to bear. Josephus is valuable for two opposite kind of reasons. On the one hand, unlike the author of Luke-Acts, he is emphatically a historian. He declares himself to be self-consciously a historian in the Greco-Roman tradition, borrows extensively from Thucydides, Polybius, and the others. On the other hand, he does not regard historia as the be-all and end-all. Whereas Luke-Acts avoids the explicit language of historiography, Josephus uses histor cognates 128 times, and most conspicuously in his prefaces where he's announcing his intentions. For variation, he liberally sprinkles in Thucydidean sungrapho words 66 times. His consciousness of writing as a historian in dialogue with other historians is clear. Less obvious, indeed rarely noticed, I think, in the scholarship, are Josephus's views of history as a distinctively Greek pursuit. And in keeping with his self-presentation as a non-Greek, and a very proud non-Greek, his view that higher truths cannot be found by historical inquiry. Even if, he says, he can write history better than the Greeks can. The most important truth comes from revelation via prophecy. To see this point in brief, consider two parts of his corpus: the prologue to the war and the end of his Appion. In War's prologue, after establishing his credentials as a historian without parallel concerning the recent conflict, Josephus turns, strangely, to an attack on Greek intellectuals in 1:13. This is somewhat puzzling until we begin to realize that he understands historiography to be a Greek pursuit connected intimately with rhetoric. He criticizes contemporary Greek historians for focusing on ancient conflicts and merely rearranging the pieces of old stories, rather than dealing with a really important event that has just happened, the fall of Jerusalem. Then he brings the point home in 1:16. Although he is a foreigner, an allophilos, he has taken up the Greek challenge of history writing and done it better than anybody else, because the Greeks have lost the plot. All they care about is empty words. They don't care about truth in history writing. Josephus uses historia as a vehicle because this recent event lends itself to that kind of study, and so he put himself to the effort of writing historia. This critique of Greek culture and history reaches its explosive climax in the Against Appion. Tackling the claim that ancient Greek historians do not mention Judeans, which some have taken to be proof that Judeans were not ancient, Josephus opens a full-scale attack on Greek historiography. Deciding that the best defense is offense, he ridicules these historians for being A, latecomers to the whole business of keeping records of the past, and B, not very good at it compared to their Oriental cousins. This is clear from the fact that they all disagree with each other. Greek historians don't agree with each other, so they can't be right. They can't be telling the truth. He accuses not only Herodotus, but even gold standard Thucydides of telling fibs and not telling the truth, falsehoods. Certainly the common run of Greek historians disagree with each other all the time, he says. In the Appion, he reprises his remarks from War's prologue to attack the Greeks for being empty yappers, speakers all the time. He's at his most forceful when it comes to his main issue, the antiquity of the Judeans. And here he says, look, the ancient Judean records are not a product of historical research like your Greek records are. We have kept records from the beginning. They cover 3,000 years. They go back to Moses. They are perfectly accurate. Why? Because they come from prophecy. Moses was a prophet, and he knew about the past not through historical investigation, but through revelation. And that's why his record is perfectly accurate and reliable, and that's why Judeans are willing to die for these laws. In short, Josephus believes that ultimate truth comes from God and is found in Scripture, and this has nothing to do with historia, which is a human undertaking developed by Greeks to discover the truth about their past. By considerable effort, he trained himself to do this because he thought it would be useful for presenting the war to them in their own language. He can do historia, if he must, better than the Greeks. But it's not that important. It's not where truth lies. Now, I've dwelt on Josephus' eager pursuit of history, and yet his arm's length stance toward it because I'm proposing that Luke Acts has something of the same ambivalence. Understanding the need for historical forms in order to communicate with the audience, and yet being confident that the most important truth comes from revelation and prophecy, actually. Whether you agree with me in a study I once wrote that Luke Acts actually knows, the author knows the work of Josephus, that would help my argument, but you don't need to agree about that. My point would be stronger if I could convince you of that, but it doesn't really matter. The point is, it seems to me that Luke Acts is doing something similar, taking a similar approach from the margins of Greco-Roman society, inflected with Judean Jewish knowledge from the Bible. Josephus' ancient ethnos was badly misunderstood in Rome, and so he resorted to history in order to clarify things. Luke Acts emerges from a very different social situation. Even though we don't know what that social situation was exactly, we can say this with confidence because the early Christians were not an ancient ethnos. They lacked a homeland. Their place was as a suspect voluntary association in the Greco-Roman world. They were not like the Judeans. This Christian author could therefore go somewhat farther than Josephus did. He merely insinuates and evokes some historical tropes, historiographical tropes, in order to suggest to his readers that he knows them. He knows about that. But he doesn't even call his work historia. With the resurrection as his central subject, and this is the most imposing and important recent event, historia cannot handle it. It's not an appropriate vehicle. So he feels confident in dispensing with common historical pursuits. Writing for an audience that is at least halfway inside the Christian fold, this author believes that a world-changing revelation has been given, quite recently, which requires simply testimony and proof, but not historical inquiry. This is what his work is about. So, my conclusions. Now I finally catch up with the slides. My conclusions. It was undoubtedly an important achievement in the 1920s when Cadbury and company linked Luke Acts with historiography. Like the later interest in New Testament rhetoric in the 70s and 80s, this helps us to embed New Testament texts in the ancient world in their real life and take us away from abstract theological postulates about them. This approach tried to rescue Luke Acts from both abstract theology and from a naive conservative view of history as simply facts. All good, in my view. Later research on classical historiography, however, has shown it to be an amorphous being with no generic constraints. And more recent research on Luke Acts has wondered whether these texts belong to the historiographical genre or not. So this leaves us with two questions. Could Luke Acts be included among historiographical texts? And should it be included among historiographical texts? The answers I've proposed, though I think they work for Luke Acts as such, get some inspiration from Josephus. He makes clear that he's writing history because he has to and it suits his purpose, but also that he views history as a Greek pursuit that doesn't always get at the truth and not the most important truths. Judeans have a revelation, and they have prophets who have brought this revelation to them. It seems to me that the author of Luke Acts is working in the same vein and goes farther. Whereas the recent cataclysmic event that concerned Josephus invited historiographical analysis, the one that Luke Acts is talking about isn't amenable to historical inquiry. So this author borrows some historiographical tropes, but insists that the really important news comes through revelation and through prophecy. He's not investigating the past open-endedly. He's not weighing possibilities. He's not talking about polis affairs or any of those issues that historiographers dealt with. Therefore, he avoids use of historia or sumgrapho language. I do not think he is suggesting that he's incapable of it. Yesterday, in the section on the seminar on Acts 17, we saw clear evidence that he knows classical literature and he knows how to do this stuff, but he is putting it aside because, in his view, the important revelation is not subject to historical inquiry. Thank you very much.